Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode considers timelines in archaeology. A timeline offers a convenient depiction of the past in terms of specific events and elongated time periods that have occurred in the world's natural and cultural history. Somehow the findings from archaeology often have been misunderstood or misrepresented in these standard timelines. I would like to address some of those issues in this video. I hope for this information to help toward more accurate timelines and more realistic interpretations of those timelines, not only in archaeology but also in other disciplines that study aspects of the human past. Additionally, some of this information may be useful for people who create or develop fantasy world-building settings in works of fiction and in games. A timeline in archaeology superficially may appear to be vague or awkward when compared with the detailed points of a timeline in written history. Most timelines in recorded history can include numerous specific events, pinpointing not only the calendar year of an event, but also the month or even the day of the known event. Timelines in archaeology rarely can be so precise. Typically in archaeology, a timeline involves large blocks of time that extend for some centuries or even some millennia. Moreover, in archaeology, the timelines were different for each cultural group in various places around the world. These kinds of geographic differences, of course, have occurred during the scope of written history as well, but they easily could be misrepresented or misunderstood in archaeology. A classic example in an archaeology timeline would depict major periods of raw materials technologies, such as a Stone Age, a Bronze Age, and an Iron Age. These periods have been documented in several places, but the details were different from one place to another. Many cultural groups, in fact, never experienced a Bronze Age, but instead they adopted bronze and iron technologies all at once at a later point in time. This timeline of raw materials technology does not in any way imply that people needed to follow this single progression from stone to bronze and then to iron technologies. In reality, the access was differential and situational around the world. Similar issues still exist today. Moreover, at least in principle, people could choose to reject or abandon different modes of technology. In practical terms, people with stone tool traditions typically have recognized the effectiveness of bronze or iron tools whenever they gained access to those technologies. Nonetheless, these transitions should not be mistaken as signs of advancement of a society or a civilization. Rather, these transitions simply reflected the choices of people to adopt new technologies that they perceived to be beneficial to them at the time. At any given point in time, a society that just so happened to use iron tools was not innately superior or inferior to another society that happened to use stone tools. In other words, the use of different modes of raw materials technology do not reflect levels of social advancement. When a timeline does show these periods of stone through bronze and then iron ages, then these periods should be understood as describing what happened in terms of the raw materials technology in one particular place of the world. The timeline was different in nearly every place. Similar issues apply in other aspects of the archaeological record, such as when people may or may not have transitioned from hunter-gatherer lifestyles into farming or herding economies. Often in history, people have misinterpreted these kinds of timelines as if farming societies were the ideal goals of what all people in the world should become. In reality, some cultural groups have preferred to avoid farming, and instead to sustain their traditions of hunting, gathering, and fishing. Moreover, even in farming societies or in modern industrial societies, many people have continued to practice hunting, gathering, and fishing traditions. The notion of a single, unilinear social evolutionary timeline has been contradicted by the basic facts of the worldwide archaeological record, at least since the early 1900s. Nonetheless, this ideology of a unilinear social evolution of all of humanity persisted among some of the world's leading social anthropologists and social historians, based on their faulty comprehension of the archaeological evidence, compounded with their misinterpretations. Today, these viewpoints generally are recognized as ideological justifications for imperial conquest or colonial expansion, specifically as attempted by the people who have regarded themselves as if they represented the ideals of world civilization. Without making value judgments, the archaeological record can describe, factually, what happened during different time periods, and those measurable time periods can be plotted in a conventional timeline. A timeline in archaeology can follow the material evidence in the same chronological order of the stratigraphic layers in an excavation. This kind of timeline in archaeology can identify the major periods of when people made and used distinctive forms and styles of artifacts, when they lived in different habitats, when they made various housing constructions, and when they ate different foods in their diets. The results of this kind of timeline can apply for a specific site, and the details tend to be at least slightly different from one site to another. When accounting for those slight differences among each site individually, a timeline can be adjusted for depicting the overall trends and patterns in a geographic area. At a certain point, though, the site-by-site differences always will become too different from each other to align in a unified timeline. Whenever or wherever those limits can be identified in the archaeological evidence, then the timelines need to be split into separate geographic regions, areas, or sub-areas. A timeline in archaeology typically works with large scales of overall patterns and trends in the evidence. The boundaries of these large-scale units could occur in varying degrees of abrupt through diffuse, in the geographic space, and in the blocks of time. With this understanding of how a timeline works in archaeology, you may be wondering how a timeline could be possible at a worldwide scale. The actual archaeological evidence is different in each region, and therefore a worldwide timeline seems impossible. In terms of this kind of global timeline, some clues have emerged from the world's natural history, specifically in the records of ancient climate and sea level. For instance, the last major ice age of the Pleistocene started perhaps 2 million years ago, and it continued until about 12,000 through 11,000 years ago. Within this Pleistocene epoch, several sub-periods referred to the times of glacial conditions versus interglacial conditions. The period around 26,000 through 20,000 years ago was the last glacial maximum, when the ice sheets and glaciers were at their maximum extent. Following the melting of this last glacial maximum ice, the shape of the world's inhabitable land masses forever changed. The present post-glacial period is known as the Holocene, although this Holocene period in terms of climate started perhaps 11,000 years ago. The rising sea level stabilized at some point around 8,000 years ago in most places. Several other fluctuations in climate and sea level have occurred within the last several thousand years of the Holocene. Within this timeline of climate and sea level of the world, a few of the major events in ancient human migrations can be plotted. For instance, the expansions of Neanderthals, Denisovans, and anatomically modern Homo sapiens all occurred during the last major ice age of the Pleistocene. The migration of people across the Bering Strait into the American continents occurred at least by 14,000 years ago, but perhaps slightly earlier, after the end of the last glacial maximum, but certainly before the end of the Pleistocene. At least a few studies based on modern DNA of present-day living people have estimated that their ancestors diverged or redistributed in their populations around 8,000 years ago, coinciding with the newly stabilized coastlines of habitats of the post-glacial Holocene world. This correlation is obvious for most archaeologists, yet somehow it has been ignored by most modern DNA analysts. A holistic timeline could accommodate multiple lines of evidence in natural and cultural history. Some aspects could be applied at a worldwide scale, but most parts in fact would need to be constrained within definable geographic limits. If the topic of study is about worldwide population movements, then the analyst or scholar, at the very least, should be aware of the multiple timelines from different regions. If the topic of study is about a particular region, then a timeline can be more tightly focused with more details. In any case, a timeline in archaeology typically involves large blocks of time periods. In contrast, a timeline in written history typically involves numerous individually pinpointed events. Of course, the human past included innumerable specific events throughout all time periods in archaeology as well as in written history. In archaeology, though, the surviving material record allows only large-scale units of observations in extended time periods and applied over large geographic areas. The limits of the evidence allow only these large-scale patterns and trends in a timeline of archaeology. Nonetheless, those large-scale units can be understood as representing the results of numerous individual events of real people who lived in the past. In my view, timelines in archaeology work best when they are combined with other lines of evidence and when they plainly describe what happened in the past during measured time periods and within definable geographic areas. With this solid descriptive basis, any interpretations can be more realistic and productive. In concluding this episode, I hope that I have encouraged new ways of thinking about timelines in archaeology. When you encounter such a timeline, then how would you evaluate its effectiveness, and how would you improve on it? If you have not already subscribed to this channel, then please consider to do so. You always are welcome to share with your friends and explore more online videos with the Archaeology Studio.